So today, when even justice seems even less possible, particularly with what is happening in West Asia, what kind of moment do you think that was, and what kind of moment do you think we are in at this point of time? Welcome to another episode of Justify. While the Nuremberg trials echo widely in our collective past, the same cannot be said of the Tokyo trials. This is a curiosity, especially given the fact that there was an Indian judge in the Tokyo trials, Radhabinod Pal, someone who is worshipped in Tokyo, literally. There is a shrine to Radhabinod Pal in the Yakusuni Memorial, but is often and almost forgotten in his home country. Not entirely so. There has been quite a bit of writing on him that has happened in fits and starts. But one of the most compelling pieces that I have read is I Am the People, written by Professor Partha Chatterjee. And today we have the singular honor of having with us on this episode of Justify Professor Partha Chatterjee, who is a political theorist and anthropologist and wears many hats, and today is here because of the hat that he wore, which was his book, I Am the People, which is taken or derived from his lectures at Columbia University. So, Parthoda, it's a real pleasure to have you on Justify. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Parthoda, let me dive straight into Radhabinod Pal because it's a very interesting piece that you write where you say that Justice Pal's dissent in the Tokyo trials, where he acquitted all the Japanese war criminals of all crimes for which they were charged, came in a particular moment of decolonization, where you say, and I quote, even justice, unquote, was not possible. And you have also said that that moment has passed, and we are well past that moment. So today, when even justice seems even less possible, particularly with what is happening in West Asia, what kind of moment do you think that was, and what kind of moment do you think we are in at this point of time?
Well, you see, even justice was a term which was actually used by Justice Pal in his judgment. And what he was trying to point to was almost the impossibility, he thought, of there being justice for the peoples outside of Europe, most of these countries which had long been colonized by European powers. Japan, of course, had never been formally colonized. But his argument was that the kind of legal proceedings and the charges that had been brought against Japan in the Tokyo trials was, and these were again terms that he was using, victor's justice. And if you look at the specific charges that were brought, there were really two sets of crimes that the top political and military leaders of Japan were accused of. One was the crime of waging aggressive war. And the second was the crime against humanity. Now, the first one, interestingly, and clearly this was a major argument that Justice Pal was raising, there was no such law previously. This was a completely new idea which had been brought, especially at the time of the Nuremberg trials and extended to the Tokyo trials, which was actually to accuse the leaders of a country of waging war.
That's right.
So effectively, the argument was that from now on, war will be illegal.
Outlawing war itself.
Yes. Exactly. So except on grounds of self-defense, and there the explanation was that self-defense would be something that would be determined by the country which believed it had been attacked, So there was a little catch there. But effectively, this was claimed to be the law. Now, Justice Pal, first of all, his major argument was that this was a completely new law. That when Japan declared war on the United States, for instance, no such law was in existence. So how could someone be accused of a crime, right, when there was that act was not criminal when it took place? So this was one very major argument he kept repeating. And what he basically then said, that the only reason why this is now becoming possible is that the victors, the winners in a particular war, were now making up new laws.
That's right.
In order to justify or call an act that the losing side had committed. He also pointed out that, of course, the victorious side, the Allied side, had also waged war, but they were not being charged. That's right. So this was one major part of Justice Pal's argument. The second was in relation to the crimes against humanity, all the various atrocities and so on against civilian populations. Now, here, Justice Pal's argument was that he admitted that there were many acts that had been committed against civilian populations by the Japanese soldiers, which would come under the definition of crimes against humanity, right? War crimes. And in fact, he also pointed out that thousands of Japanese soldiers had in fact been prosecuted, and several hundreds had actually been executed for war crimes. But these were as ordinary war crimes. Now, what this particular charge in the Tokyo trials amounted to was to actually bring that same charge of crimes against humanity, charge all the political and military leaders of Japan, and to make the argument
command responsibility.
Exactly. And this is where the conspiracy and all of that argument comes in.
That's right.
The argument was that it's the top leadership which had declared these kinds of actions by the military as policy and had directed their soldiers to do all this, right? So here, Pal's argument was really more a kind of empirical argument. Where is the evidence for this? And he went through the entire evidence that had been presented, all the witnesses and so on, basically to say that there is no real evidence that the top leadership had actually instructed the soldiers to do this. And in fact, he made a very interesting argument. He said that the kinds of acts that the Japanese soldiers had supposedly committed against civilian populations had been committed before in several earlier wars by several earlier, other countries. Nowhere was this argument made, right? So his argument, in a sense, was that what the Japanese soldiers did was, in fact, nothing extraordinary. This is something that had become, as it were, ordinary practice in the course of warfare, including the Second World War itself, and he gave many examples.
Absolutely.
And of course, the most glaring example, which Justice Pal repeated several times, was the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Yes. So there is no bigger example of civilian populations being attacked and terrorized simply to force the other side to surrender, right?
Absolutely. So I think if I were to just stop you for one moment there, Partha, because this argument has the greatest moral force. When I finished reading Pal's 1200-page judgment, it had the greatest moral force to say that you can't now create a tribunal, vest it with certain selective jurisdiction on certain kinds of crimes, and what seems like the most monstrous act, which is the dropping of the atom bombs, is obviously excluded because you don't want to try yourself. Now, while it has that moral force, if I were to look at it as a lawyer, obviously two wrongs don't make a right. That should also be part of the jurisdiction. It is not. But at the same time, and this is something that you write yourself, is that perhaps the weakest link of Pal's judgment lies in the fact that there is a kind of blanket dismissal of this well documented evidence that some of the actions of the Japanese leadership were to actively promote war as a means of waging foreign policy. Okay, what I mean, and while your point on aggression is well taken, in fact, as it stands, aggression is a crime under the Rome Statute of the ICC, but has not been enforced even today because countries cannot agree on a definition of aggression. So, let alone
Not
1940.
only that, countries don't declare war anymore.
Countries don't declare it; they just go into war without saying
Exactly.
that they have. And so I think that as far as the point about war crimes are concerned, what do you think is going on there? Because for a lawyer, it seems that there is a blanket dismissal, which is not the framework in which the law operates. I mean, the law operates in terms of looking at every single case differently, looking at the evidence in that particular case. Pal, of course, does some of that, but almost, it appears,
Yep.
comes to a predetermined conclusion that everyone is acquitted. Is this, in your view, a kind of condemnation of an expression of Japanese sovereignty that went too far? Do you think this is an attempt to expose a kind of rule of law as a cloak? What do you think is going on with Pal's
My own
en
sense
masse
is,
acquittal?
yeah, my own sense is that Justice Pal was particularly concerned to point out that even though many of these actions, and he did mention things like the Nanjing massacre and so on, which was really quite outrageous in many ways. Uh, but but his attempt was to basically make the point that these were not particularly extraordinary offenses as far as modern warfare was concerned. What he was trying to show was that things that were quite similar, right, of an army and a military actually targeting a civilian population in order to weaken the other side, to weaken their resolve, to show mass terror, to force the civilian population to, in a sense, abandon their political leadership or turn against their political leadership. All of these tactics had been tried out, right? So I think one of the things why this what looks like an attempt to really minimize the extent of the acts committed by the Japanese soldiers, I think Justice Paul was really trying to show that if you compare this with other things that had been done before by other armies, this was not very extraordinary. In other words, he was really quite concerned about trying to prove that it did not require any special policy declaration or any special directions from the Japanese leadership to their soldiers to get them to do this, because doing this was, in a sense, perfectly ordinary. So
That's
this
right.
was, I think, his main, point here. Why
But
he
don't you
was,
think that begs the question? And I have some sympathy for this point of view, certainly that Pal is espousing. But don't you think that begs the question that perhaps the end of the Second World War was a kind of moment whether it was with the coming into existence of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
yeah.
that it was the world in some sense. Of course, this could be a little bit of a generalization, but the Western world, in some sense, coming together to try and say that there is a certain kind of action which may have been okay in the past and certainly was par for the course in terms of exercise of sovereignty in the past, but is no longer okay now. And this is that inflection point. What would you say to that kind of argument?
But you see, this is an interesting thing that Justice Paul also actually took up this point, because to this whole declaration, or this sort of in a stance which the Allied powers were taking, that this must be the last time. We should not have this anymore. Okay? Justice Paul immediately pointed out that look what happens after the Japanese surrender, and the various countries or territories which the Japanese had occupied in Asia, they were all taken over and given back to their former European colonial powers. He pointed out Indonesia, for instance, Java, where there was already a nationalist government in place, and yet the Dutch were invited by the Allied powers to come back, and the British said, and British actually participated in putting the Dutch back in Indonesia. The French went back into Indochina. The British went into Malaya, into Burma, right? All of these places, the former colonial powers go back. So Pal was effectively saying, well, where are you doing anything different? You are simply going back to the position before the Second World War, right? Where all of these countries could, in fact, return to a position of where the European powers would remain, dominant, and they would rule all of these other peoples, right? And so, where is even justice? So this is so I think this was also a particularly important point that Justice Pal was making about things like, he didn't mention the things like the United Nations, the the Declaration of Human Rights, and so on and so forth. That if these were to be universally valid, then you could not have a situation where large parts of the peoples of the world would not have their sovereignty, that the sovereignty would in fact belong to some other powers, right? Uh, and of course, we mustn't forget at this time, the United Nations only had something like 51 or 52 members, right? Most of the countries that we now know are members of the UN were not. They were all, parts of European empires. So that was actually the point. So looking back, it just seems to us, of course, that this is the big, point of change, that after this, that ultimately the European powers had to retreat. Some of them retreated through negotiated transfers of power. Other places there were actually rebellions and so on, and they were forced to leave. Sure. But by the 1960s and so on, it becomes quite obvious that the old form of colonial rules would not continue anymore, right? And you would have a world where national sovereignty, self-determination would in fact be the general rule. But what I think what's important to realize is that 1946, 47, when Justice Pal is writing this was by no means guaranteed.
That's right. That's right. I think that's a critical point, and I think I'm always personally always skeptical of these moments in time.
Yeah.
I mean, my own work on the Constitution, as in I don't think that even the Indian Constitution or post-colonial constitutions came out of any particular moments. I think there is a continuum, and we tend to kind of isolate some particular times as inflection points. Sometimes may be more important than others, but Paul's argument, as in, I see resonances of that, say, in this debate on climate change, where countries now say that countries in the global south and now say that you can't now stop thermal power plants because you've obviously used that, you've built up your energy grid, you've polluted at a time when it was not illegal to pollute, and now you're stopping us from doing it.
Sure.
And I think it's a similar kind of argument saying that you cannot freeze this question of legality and illegality of war at a time when you are sovereign and you have acquired the territories that you have, but we continue to remain colonies.
Yeah.
And so to that kind of argument, which is that you cannot artificially freeze a moment in time and say thus far and no more. Okay, what in your view is, how do we see this kind of argument? Because at some level there is a kind of, again, as I said, there is a kind of at least a rhetorical force to this kind of argument, though at some other level you can see that there needs to be some inflection point before after which some things which are wrong, and we clearly with the benefit of time perhaps see them as wrong and they have evolved as wrong, should be declared as wrong. So so how do you see this playing out?
You see, there's an important question about what are expressed or pronounced as sorts of universally valid moral truths or moral principles, right? So, for instance, things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was such a kind of universal declaration, really, as it explicitly describes itself as such. Now, the interesting question is, how are these universal principles actualized? And who actualizes? You see,
That's right.
what is the social force that actualizes those terms? You can go back, if you move away from international law to national law, think of the famous sort of French Revolution Declaration, the rights of man and citizen, right? Famous declaration, universal. Everybody, is supposedly falls under it. But of course, we know that even in France at that time, and of course, ever since, even though this principle has been invoked so many times, it's been invoked not just in Europe for European nations, but it's been invoked later on by countries like India and everybody else. So that's the principle on the basis of which we are now claiming uh, this universal right of self-determination, equality, liberty, etc., etc. But it always remains a question: is there a social force in either national society or in international society which will put this into practice, into actually recognize? And this is where, if you come back to this moment of the Tokyo trial or Justice Pal's argument, yes, the declaration has been made. We all accept that as a universal principle, this is a principle we uphold. But who is implementing this? Who has the power to implement? And once you come there, then of course, Justice Pal, and ever since then, you can show numerous cases where the application of this principle has been selective. It's various powerful nations have chosen to apply it in one case and not apply it in other cases. So, in fact, even though you might say that in principle, for instance, you take the United Nations General Assembly, right? Every country is formally equal. Every country has one vote. Okay? But is that how the world, balance of power actually operates in the world? We know it doesn't, because some countries are more sovereign than other countries, right? So and yet the principle is there. The principle is always there to be invoked when it's convenient. But there are lots of other instances where that universal principle is suspended and say, "Oh, this is an exceptional case. You can't apply it here." Right? So that becomes the kind of technique every time, right? And it depends entirely on whether or not the social force that's applying that principle, right, is able to apply it universally. And to do it universally, you must have a certain universal spread of that social force, which doesn't exist. Clearly, there are such glaring inequalities of power.
No, I think it actually reminds me of a question in legal philosophy, that the question of what is law is best answered by who is enforcing it, in terms of what kind of court
Correct.
is doing that function, rather than asking that definitional question. And I think this is very resonant of that. And I think if we were to move beyond this inflection point in global politics and history, that the end of the Second World War period, you also argued in your book that Pal's stance was perhaps reminiscent of a certain kind of Bengali Bhadralok, who juxtaposes Japanese aggression, in some sense, as a kind of as the East kind of coming back in some way. Japanese, I wouldn't say aggression. I mean, aggression is a strong word, but Japanese muscle flexing as a kind of first. A great hope for of an Eastern revival, as in you see that in Rabindranath quite a bit. Rabindranath, of course, turns sour when the Japanese start behaving like an imperial force. But other people like Pal and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose don't, and see this as kind of a revival of the East. And Sugato Bose, also on Asia After Europe, talks about an Asian identity, of which Pal is some kind of motif. So what do you say to this kind of argument, that this is in some sense a revival of the East, and so the revival of the East justifies some amount of excessive muscle flexing that Japan may have done in the Second World War.
You know, first of all, I don't think Justice Pal's position on this, especially his estimation of Japan in relation to the Western powers, was very unusual. It was in fact quite consistent with the sorts of understanding of a broader nationalist view of world politics at the time. Now, yes, there were some people who were much more directly in favor, in fact, of the Axis powers. There were admirers of Hitler. There were admirers of Japan, much broader. But I don't think Pal was quite one of that. You see, there's a very interesting biography that Nariaki Nakazato, a Japanese scholar, who's actually a scholar of Bengal, so he knows Bengal quite well. He wrote this book on Pal. And of course, Nakazato was particularly concerned to refute the kinds of, adulation of the right-wing, ultra-nationalists in Japan, who, as you say, they elevate Pal to a kind of divine status almost. Nakazato was very much against that kind of ultra-nationalism. So Nakazato tries to show that Pal was, first of all, that he had huge contacts with Subhash Bose and was not just sympathetic, but perhaps even in some sort of collaboration with him. I don't see that that's quite the case. In fact, I would say that the broader sentiment where most, it's not just Bengali middle class, I would say very large parts of Indian nationalists themselves didn't really think of Japan as an enemy of India during the war. And this you will see even within the broader All India Congress, for instance. Yes, there were elements of particularly people like Nehru in particular, who was much more familiar with European politics and was much more closely involved there. And so he was much more aware of the dangers of fascism, etc. But look at the broader views within the Congress. At the height of the Japanese attack or possible attack on India, the Congress declares Quit India Movement, 1942, right? And Gandhi says, well, let Japan come and we will decide what to do. But British, you leave now, right? Now, so that was a very generalized sentiment. Later on, Subhash Bose, for instance, even though they look at what happens at the time of the Subhash Bose, the INA trials in Delhi, and the kinds of broad, patriotic, support for, even though he was supposedly fighting against Indian troops in the British Indian Army, right? So I think Pal was not particularly, different from this general view. So in that general view, he did not begin like most of the Western judges on the tribunal did. He did not begin for a position to look at Japan as a defeated enemy. This was not his position, right? He was prepared, far more prepared than the others, to actually concede that the political point of Japan as not necessarily trying to dominate the world and share world power with Hitler and so on. I don't think he quite saw it that way. He clearly saw Japan as wanting to rid Asia of European, colonial power, imperial powers. Now, what would have come in its place, whether Japanese occupation of all these lands would have necessarily meant the liberation of the peoples of, Java or Malaya or India, or I don't think Pal quite went that far, because in a sense that never happened. In a sense, once again, coming to the moment where he's making those declarations, Japan was defeated. I mean, that was the fact. Japan had been defeated. So the kind of possibilities that what would have been the political consequences of a Japanese victory in World War II is not something I think, Pal was particularly bothered about, because that clearly had never, it would have been a completely counterfactual kind of exercise. He didn't want to, use it, do it.
That's right. That's right. And Nakazato's book is particularly revealing because um, reading Pal's text as a legal text, as in there, the way we come to it initially, though it's not taught as part of international law curriculum in India, but the way I came to it is through the lens of legal positivism. That Pal was
Mm.
traditionally shown as someone who is in some sense positivist, saying that there is no place for an ex post facto law. Um, but my I had an initial discomfort with that kind of reading, because it seems to me that Pal was not operating in that legal positivism vis-a-vis natural law framework at all. It seemed to me that this was an inchoate kind of framework, and I still don't have kind of the language to describe it, but it seemed like a framework where the very framing of the rule of law as a certain kind of articulation of crimes by certain countries at certain times is questioned. And this could happen in a domestic setting as well, where there is a kind of healthy skepticism, which taken to its extreme is perhaps some form of civil disobedience. But broadly speaking, it seems to be a questioning of the framework of how we understand the rule of law itself, vis-a-vis operating within it and saying that I'm not positivist. And how do you see this? Do you think that Pal's framework is this kind of general liberal order working within this rule of law construct, or do you think there's something else going on here?
You see, my sense is that it's true that there are various points where you can argue that Pal is actually using legal positives, especially the point that you made, that how can you charge one side of having committed a crime which was not a crime when it was committed. But he also does not shirk away from using natural law arguments. His whole argument about self-determination, sovereignty, all of these kinds of things, these are appeals to universal principles of
That's right.
natural justice, right? So he is equally comfortable using arguments from, so which is why I think it is actually not correct to either put him in one slot or the other, because he was not operating, as you say, he was not operating on those terms. What his overall argument, it seems to me, is that he would have liked, if I may put it this way, the universal principles which had been declared, right? And these universal principles of natural justice, whose moral validity he accepted, his argument was, let us use the rules or the principles of positive law to see how much of it have you actually enacted in positive law. And here his argument was, you failed. You've not applied it everywhere. So I think that would be a kind of argument that he was trying to make.
It's interesting that you say that, because this is exactly the kind of argument that I think keeps getting made in, say, the Indian Supreme Court on a very regular basis. So you see some of these comments that come from Supreme Court judges, sometimes unsolicited. Uh, you know, I recently saw that you'd seen the Mahmoodabad, the professor of Ashoka University, who was given bail
Oh yeah,
by the Supreme Court, but was also given a healthy dose of avuncular advice in terms of
Yes.
what he should say and what he shouldn't say. And I see this as a kind of pattern across cases. This could be, I mean, I follow the court closely, not only in cases which are civil liberties cases, but also generally you see this a lot in matrimonial cases, for example, where the law is very clear
Oh,
in
yes.
terms of what is done, what is not done. But it almost seems always that the judges are operating on the basis of an inarticulated sense of what is right. Okay, now there is a sense like that. The law may capture some part of it. Okay, and to that extent, maybe they'll pay some obeisance to it. But otherwise, it's really their understanding of whatever that sense of right is. So, in my sense, and this, of course, I've always been conflicted because this is very much a double-edged sword. In some
Mm,
cases, like Pal's, it can fall in a way that you think tends towards justice of some kind, because at least tends towards lessening injustice. In some other cases, it could take the form of
exactly.
its own form of judicial despotism. So,
Absolutely. Correct.
but I think that there is something deeper in what you said
Mm.
at Pal, just relating this to your previous point, that I don't think Pal is exceptional in this way. I think in that
Right.
sense, he's kind of he's of course resonating a sentiment of the time when it comes to the Indian national movement. He's also resonating a sentiment of the time and later when it comes to the Indian legal fraternity, which
Sure.
sort of I mean has this rules based order. But I mean, sorry, I'm going to digress now. But your book, I mean, the on Bhawal Shonashi, the princely impostor, I think
Yeah.
is a very good example of how a system that is not used to a rules based order of this kind, which is based on evidence and trial, now is grappling with that kind
Yeah.
of system. So do you see? I mean, this is just more of a comment, but do you
No,
see?
no, sure, sure. You're right. But you see, interesting thing is that as far as Justice Paul is concerned, he is making that argument as you say, that invoking certain natural principles of universal principles and yet applying sort of rules of positive law. But he is very much doing this conscious of the fact that he is in a very tiny minority,
That's right.
right? He is arguing from a position of weakness. Because he has no confidence at all that what the argument that he's making will in fact carry the day. It wouldn't. So it's not as though, this is like a judge in a district court and so on, right? That's not his position in this tribunal. Uh, Interestingly, for instance, there are, I later found out that Justice Paul, for instance, was a major, at that time, uh, very small voice, right, arguing against the death penalty in India,
That's right.
right, in the 1950s. So, so he did have certain, but again, he would have been in a complete minority at the time. But uh, so he often did take up positions which were not fashionable, which were, and he was quite aware of the fact that the other people around him did not subscribe to his views. But I think the Tokyo trials was clearly one such instance.
That's right. So let me turn to the question of popular sovereignty, because that is one of the key themes of your lectures and also now the book, I Am the People. And you make the argument that the kind of populism that is seen in the West is not unique, and it kind of has been seen in the global South in terms of the fact that there is a floating understanding of who the people are, and there is a kind of personalization of that sovereignty. And given the moment that we are in, do you think that with President Trump, as in this is exactly the same kind of populism that we have seen in India and in other countries in Africa, for example? Or do you think that there are differences of either category of or type in terms of the type of populism that we see in the West, particularly in the United States?
Yeah. You see, the big difference I'd say is that in countries like India, for instance, populism is emerging in a situation where the forms of liberal democracy had never quite struck deep roots, right? So in India is a particularly good example because many of the other countries where you would find populist leaders today, they've never even had a formally, formal constitutional order of liberal electoral democracy. Many of these countries did not quite have it. India did. India does have at least this rather exceptional history of having a formal liberal constitutional order, which has more or less existed, unchallenged. If you take out the emergency years, for more than 70 years. Now, that's the framework, but yet we know what the limitations of liberal democracy are in the Indian case. So the fact that, in a sense, the liberal values in the social sense only exist within tiny, educated, middle class, urban kinds of settings where you have formal rules of what you might call civil society, right? Where, people pay taxes and people obey the law and people have respect for property, etc., all of those kinds of things. Outside it, even though the same formal laws are supposed to apply, right? We know justice doesn't operate in that way. There is a huge intervention of politics. So people, when they say that this is our right, we demand it, it's not as though there are civil social organizations through which they achieve this. They go to politicians, they go to political parties, right? And they often make their demands in ways that are otherwise completely illegal. They would, hold up traffic, create ruckus, attract attention of the media, and say this is outrageous, we demand something. Now, that's the context in which populism has emerged in India, right? Where populism basically is where you have all of these many different small groups which are disaffected, which feel they are oppressed, that they have been denied various things. And populism is when a leader or a party or a movement is able to tie all of these separate demands together into some kind of general demand and persuade people, well, that's the enemy. That's the enemy out there. It's because of that enemy that all of us are being denied justice. Okay, so let's fight that enemy. So that enemy is identified in different places in different ways. Now, in the Western case of let's say, the kinds of populism that you now see, US has now become a very obvious example, but you see this in several European countries too. They emerge after a long period, decades, of fairly stable liberal politics, right? And there's something that emerged as lacking in that politics, which has now come out in the open. And for many people, the crucial change is the fact that after World War II, you have had so many immigrants from non-European countries, right? And they came in because it became economically necessary for these people because there was not enough, labor, people to do particularly the low-paid jobs. The more the Western countries became prosperous, especially Europe, they became prosperous, even though European working class became middle class, right? Everybody went to school, everybody went to university. All the low-paid jobs, the menial work, was then done by these immigrants. They were brought in. And yet, this is the crucial argument then, liberal democracy functioned as long as there was a certain cultural homogeneity. As soon as that homogeneity was broken, right, then you begin to get all of these kinds of things to say, and then liberal democracy begins to split apart, and you begin to get people to say, well, this, we want to retain a white country. Why should all these people from other places come and take our jobs and so on and so forth? This is the kind of thing, the anger that you get reflected in somebody like Trump. Okay, at base, most of his followers are basically saying, we want to return to a United States where it was the white people who ran the country. Why are all these other people coming in, right? Now, this is something which is new in the experience of Europe or the US, right? There is a racial underpinning here, which is beginning to come out. And then you get the populism, and if you look at it, the common theme in all of these European populist movements is to target the non-white immigrant. That becomes the enemy. Somewhere it's the Muslim, somewhere it's the black, somewhere it's, different ways different countries are describing this, but basically it's the threat to the old cultural homogeneity, right? Which is now identified as the enemy. So I think in that sense, fundamentally, the two kinds of populism are not necessarily the same. In the Indian case, I would say populism in some sense has become the general rule. That is to say, for instance, if you look at Indian politics now, there is competitive populism.
That's
right. It's not that the opposition side becomes populist and the other side isn't, right? Yeah. You very often basically get, fights between two populist parties. I mean, if you look at Tamil Nadu, that's the kind of situation you've had for the last 50 years.
And it almost becomes like arithmetic, like exactly. In terms of whose populism has more numbers.
So it's competitive in the sense, if you are populist in this way, I will be even more populist in some.
That's right. That's
so
right.
You promise even
2
more.
rupees a kilo for rice, 1 rupee 50,
Exactly.
and that kind of thing. But I think what does this do to your dynamic that you talked about, this, which is that the post-war continuation of the dynamic of liberalism at home and authoritarianism in the colonies? Now that there are no so-called colonies in that sense, do you think it's also becoming authoritarianism at home?
Well, I think, in general, the argument would be the argument that I was pointing out. It is the right to make exception, right? So in the old situation where you had a metropolitan country and you had colonies, right? The argument was that the colony was an exception.
That's
right. So when somebody like John Stuart Mill would say, representative government is universally the best form of government, except you can't have it in India, because that's exceptional. So it's the same kind of, that's the old way of doing it. Today, as you say, you don't have that. But what you have is all of these, everybody is equally sovereign, right? But I have the right to declare that for this reason, at this point of time, this country can't be sovereign anymore. So I can declare, well, Iraq is no longer sovereign, right? Or Iran is less sovereign than others, right? So that's the kind of distinctions that you can make. And I think that is where, in a sense, it is the same principle. The principle is who has the right to make, as it were, the colonial exception.
That's right. So we'll end with a hypothetical question. Is that when we see the US launch its strikes against Iran, one point that was conspicuous by its absence is that no one was talking about international law at all.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely.
No one was even talking about it. I mean, let alone the fact as to whether trying to justify it as legal. No one is talking about this at all, right?
Absolutely.
And Israel's case, as in they were talking about it a little bit, but really not that much. We were not getting into, Israel was not getting into justifications on as to how we can, widen the net of self-defense and so on and so forth. We were not discussing it in that framing. So how do you think Radhabinod Pal would have seen this at this point?
He would have seen a complete abandonment of even the promise of even justice. At this in 1946, 47, at least there was a kind of, expression of a promise. Now it's been abandoned to the extent that you can actually have the claim that the International Court of Justice is an enemy. Yes. So the judges of the International Court are enemies, right? in fact, you're almost at the point. I sometimes think that tomorrow Trump will suddenly say, "Well, I don't care about the UN. Let the United Nations. I'll abolish it."
Hmm.
It's perfectly possible. It's almost coming to that kind of situation, and fundamentally, it seems to me that the principle on which international law first began. I mean, we must not forget, international law began as a law that applied to the major countries of Europe within a framework of balance of power,
That's
right?
right.
Within a framework of balance of power. The law was supposed to apply because no one country should become dominant. That
That's
was
right.
the principle. And at that point of time, all of those other powers outside Europe, they were not really part of the
That,
family of nations. Now, over time, all that has expanded. We know that certainly the United Nations and so on, and of course later on the international courts, right, became a kind of framework to say that international law applies equally to everybody because all countries of the world are now sovereign nation states. But, and this is the big but, this held as long as the, the effective dominance of the Western powers remained intact, even post the loss of colonies.
that's
Okay,
right.
so within that framework, you had something like the Security Council. You had a Cold War situation where the Western powers were balanced against the nuclear strength of the Soviet Union, right? It's within that framework that you had international law, which was supposedly valid. Now that that framework is gone, okay, in a sense, the position of dominance is up for grabs,
That's right.
right? It's up for grabs. And this is a situation where you're back to a situation almost before law began. You're almost, if you put it, this is almost like a state of nature.
That's right.
kind
As
of.
far as nations go, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
as far as nations go, we're almost coming back to a state of nature where you say, well, whoever is the most powerful will now be the sovereign of the world,
that's
right?
right.
And so here there is really, it is strength, it is force which determines law.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is a pessimistic note to end this on. And I think the pessimism can be compounded by the fact that it's not just sovereign nations, which are at least in theory accountable to their people, but also big technology corporations, which I think are
Absolutely.
also playing are talking the language of sovereignty much more.
Sure.
And I think that this state of nature, let's see where this takes us. But certainly, Radhabinod Pal will be perhaps having the last laugh and saying, "I told you so." And this is where
Yeah.
his dissent, I think, continues to remain relevant. I mean, it's a complex piece of work, but I think it continues to remain relevant for not just international lawyers, but those interested in political theory, international relations, or just interested in a good, brave, courageous piece of text. Thank you so much, Professor Chatterjee, for joining us today. That was a really good and wide ranging discussion, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too.
Thank you very much. Thank you.